I'm going to be speaking 3 times today, a couple of passages to begin with now and then after the break on a whole life disciple out in the world, and then later on in the day, a framework looking at the whole life gospel. Well, after the pressures you've been through in the last year, it's perhaps no surprise that I was drawn to this account of prisoner Paul's storm-tossed journey on his way to preach in Rome. It's a rich, rich passage, and there are obviously parallels we might explore between Paul and Jonah, 2 men in boats in a storm, both charged with communicating the good news about Jesus. And there are parallels too we might explore between Paul in a boat in a storm and the disciples of Jesus in a boat in a storm. But I want to focus on what we can learn from how Paul responds under extreme pressure. What can we learn about the scope of our ministry in a crisis? I'm sure you've been learning a lot in the last year. And what can we learn about the scope of God's support for us in the storms we face? As you know, usually in Acts, we see Paul in short encounters with people, in the marketplace or speaking on Mars Hill. But imagine for a moment that you are Paul, in a boat with 273 people who don't know Jesus. Sailors, soldiers, other prisoners, no doubt, for months. Just you and Luke and Aristarchus. 3 out of 273. That's just 1% of the population. So here you are, a minority in a workplace, as many of you are, for a prolonged period of time. So you build a good relationship with the centurion Julius, who gives you leave to see your friends. You can see that in verse 3. And then one day you're praying and God gives you a vital message for the senior management team. In this case, the centurion, the pilot, and the owner of the boat. So you're a prisoner. You've already been in 2 shipwrecks, so you've got good reason to be nervous of sea travel. But you're an itinerant teacher by trade and a maker of tents by trade, and you find yourself convinced that the action that the professional sailors are proposing to take will lead to catastrophe. You're not a sea captain, but lives are at stake. So you speak up. And by speaking up, you effectively challenge 3 types of power. The centurion, the power of the state. The pilot, the power of expertise, if you like, the senior consultant, the clinical director. And the owner, the power of money, ownership. And they ignore your advice, as often happens in all kinds of contexts. Wisdom from above is not always accepted, and wisdom from below is not always accepted, is it? We're not in control. Others make decisions, and sometimes we can see that it is not going to turn out well. But in this instance, it is important to see that there is no easy solution. The boat is caught between the incredibly dangerous weather of October, or the increasingly dangerous weather of October, and the fact that the port they're now in is not safe to winter in. Paul's advice does not solve the problem of the danger to the ship. Yes, the people can disembark, the cargo can be unloaded, the tackle removed, but the owner may well lose his ship or see it heavily damaged. Now, so Paul doesn't tell Julius that if they stay in the fair havens, all will be well with the ship. He simply says, if they go, it certainly won't. Commercially, it's risky either way. Now, it's clear that Paul has been given an insight into the future by God. He's been given a prophecy. In the Bible, we see various forms of prophecy. We see God sending people to speak to his own people, Samuel to Saul, Nathan to David, Elijah to Ahab. We see prophecy that relates to grander things, to the whole sweep of history, the fate of nations, the coming of the Messiah. And in some streams of the contemporary church, prophecy is associated with particular people having particular words from God for people in church or in home groups, or indeed for colleagues at work. At root, prophecy is simply speaking truth from God. That truth may come to us in obviously supernatural ways. An angel, as here, a dream, an audible voice, or a deep inner conviction that you just know is from God. Or it may be impressed on us by God's supernatural spirit working through our reading and reflecting on God's supernaturally inspired Bible. Here the word comes to Paul in a clearly non-religious context. It's not in a cell group or a church, but it's out in the world. And interestingly, it's essentially first and foremost for the benefit of non-believers. Paul does make his view clear, but notice that Luke doesn't say that he uses any overtly religious language to do so. At this stage, Julius, the pilot, the soldiers, the crew obviously know that Paul is a follower of the way, that is a Christian. He's under arrest for it. But Paul teaches us that we don't always need to say, God says. So God gives Paul wisdom from above, ultimately for the benefit of the whole crew. After all, God does not need a boat to get Paul to Rome. He can just whistle up a whale from the Atlantic. He's done it before, and dump Paul on an Italian beach at the mouth of the Tiber. But God is concerned for Paul's companions, and God offers information that will limit the commercial impact on the owner. Yes, you may lose your ship if you stay, but you will not lose the tackle, the cargo, or the people. Well, does God care about the physical and material well-being of the people you serve and their economic flourishing? Well, yes, he does. And it's always been so. Let me just tell you a story from the commercial sector. Father of a friend of mine was working in the plastic extrusion business, and they had no orders coming in this company. He wasn't the owner, he was just one of the managers. And it was really serious commercially, no orders. So one day he goes down to the workshop where there are 12 workbenches with the men standing around and they're silent. No one is working. And he pulls up a chair and he puts the chair by the first bench, puts his hand on the bench and prays that the Lord God would send orders and the bench would be busy again. Then he moves his chair to the next bench. He goes around all 12 of these. I mean, you've got to know that God's in that to do that in front of everybody. And he does it for 6 days in a row. On the 7th day, 72 orders come in. Does God care about the commercial well-being of organizations or the well-being of people in general? And the answer is yes, he does. And we see this concern for our physical environment, our physical and emotional and mental well-being from Eden onwards. What does God do in Eden? He creates a wonderful context for human beings to flourish in. Delicious, nutritious food, running water, gorgeous environment, a plethora of wildlife to enjoy, purposeful work to be done, fellowship with him. Yes, humankind rebel, but God's desire to bless in the material world persists. In Genesis 12, God promises that through Abraham, all nations will be blessed. And blessing is never merely understood in spiritual terms. It encompasses every aspect of human life: food, family, friends, finance. And you see the same thing in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah, God commands his people in exile to seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Notice not only to pray for the peace and prosperity, the shalom of the city of their enemies, but to seek it proactively, that shalom. And what is shalom? It is wholeness. Fulfillment, yes. It's the spiritual welfare of the city, yes, but also the political, physical, mental, economic, relational, ecological welfare of the city, or of the town, or of the hospital, the hospice, the practice, the ward, the prison, the ambulance that you're in. But back to Paul. Paul's job here is to speak up for the welfare of the others. But he doesn't win the argument, does he? Our job is often to speak truth for the benefit of others. We may not win the argument. You may believe the policy is wrong, the protocol misguided, the praxis dangerous, but it may not change. Not many of us are in charge. But speaking out may still be the right thing to do and important for the longer term, as it is here. And so you set sail and you're Paul and you know this boat is going down. What is the scope of your ministry now that you've been ignored? What's the scope of your ministry now that you know this boat is going down and you and everyone else with it? You can see the storm coming. I wonder what many of you prayed back in early March 2020 when you could see the storm coming. So this storm comes and it rages for days, and the crew do what the professionals know to do. They follow best practice. They follow the nice guidelines, if you like. They throw the cargo overboard, the tackle overboard, but it's not enough. And everyone despairs for life itself. What do? This business is going down. This business is about to go into liquidation. Let me just let the beauty of that pun sink in for you. Not that I'm going to open up the morning to a lot of sea-level jokes. Anyway, you're going down with it. Do you pray for a whale to pop by and pick you and Luke and Aristarchus up? In the midst of this terrible storm, with the boat heaving and the waves crashing and the wind blowing and the sun blotted out from your sky and your body being lurched from side to side and your stomach in your cranium, do you have any space in your heart left for anyone else? But Paul prays for everyone's mortal lives, not just their eternal lives. He intercedes holistically. He encourages them emotionally by telling them that not one of them is going to die. Not one of them. Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you, he says, to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Verse 21 and 22. Now, he doesn't remind them that they ignored his advice before to make them feel guilty. Nah, it's not like I told you so. He reminds them to strengthen their confidence in what he is now saying. I was right before, so you can trust me now. He witnesses clearly to them by telling them the source of his extraordinary confidence. Where does this confidence come from? Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. He will fulfill his purpose. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you." Notice that the angel tells Paul that God has given him the lives of all who sail with you. It's obvious that Paul has been praying for the people on his front line, for their physical rescue, and as well as no doubt for their eternal salvation. He's not like Jonah, not bothering to pray for the sailors in his boat. He's not in a team in the ICU with a panicked, angry manager, just praying to get through the 12-hour ship themselves. He's praying for everyone. He's doing what he can. He's not a doctor in an Edinburgh GP practice, content with his salary, but indifferent to the fact that the admin team haven't had a raise in 5 years. Vicky, who I met recently, is a Brompton respiratory physio, and she was deployed to the ICU, overflowing with patients. And one day she's standing there in full PPE, holding a young patient's hand. The oxygen blowers are on full blast, and she's silently praying that God would heal him and that he would save his soul. It's not the first time that she would do that, and it wouldn't be the last. And not everyone got better. And of course, often you don't know. People get moved to other places. Anyway, a few weeks later, a friend called her up and asked her if she had treated this man. And Vicky appropriately says, "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information." Well, her friend said, "Anyway, he got better and he's become a Christian." Take Vicky out of the ICU and maybe that young man dies apart from Christ. Take Paul and his companions off the boat and maybe 273 people die. Take the Christian out of the context and things aren't quite the same. Take my doctor friend Richard out of that Edinburgh GP practice and the admin people don't get their raise. Take you out of your front line and maybe things aren't quite the same. Take Lou Adams, we saw the video earlier. Take her out of that January shift when they already had too many patients and a forecourt full of ambulances and the team was overwhelmed. Take her off that shift and maybe there is no reprieve. Maybe the ambulances just keep on coming. Take the Christian out of the story, take you out of the story. Like Paul, we just don't always choose our circumstances. It's important to see he was exactly where he was meant to be. We don't choose our circumstances, but maybe we choose whether we consciously, intentionally involve God there. We're entrusted, aren't we, with our front lines. We seek the shalom of the places God puts us. Shalom over every ward, over every theatre, every ICU, every jab centre, every pharmacy. And so we are stewards of those contexts, the opportunities God gives us with a duty of care for the people around us. Stewarding context, stewarding opportunity, stewarding people. So Paul brings encouragement. And we see that in the text. God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you in verse 24. But interestingly, here again, he doesn't name Jesus, does he? He doesn't name the particular God he follows and serves. But he does make it clear that it is the God who is guaranteeing his safety and the safety of the passengers and crew. What is he actually doing here? He is simply bearing witness of God's action in his life. This is what God has done, of what he's experienced about Jesus. Does he at this point lay out the gospel in all its fullness at this? No, well, apparently not. But might people be intrigued? Might they wonder if this God is real? Might they come to Paul and ask him about it then? Or might they wait to see if they survive, to see if this God's promise is true, and then ask? Well, we don't actually know. He's bearing witness, sharing what the good news means to him on this day amongst these people in this context. How did you put up with that bad-tempered boss? How did you get that job done on time? Sometimes people see things in us that we just don't see ourselves. It was in the middle, I think, of the second wave, and Vicky, the respiratory physio I just mentioned, had been doing 12-hour shifts for 4 weeks, and many of you have been there, I guess. Not getting a break, not getting much to eat or drink, swathed in PPE, the noise of the machines so loud that you had to shout to communicate with more than twice as many patients than the ICU had ever held before, and all of them needing close attention. You know about this. Relentless, exhausting. At team meetings about how hard, she would share about how hard she'd been finding it. And then one day, out of the blue, really, a colleague said to her, "Oh, Vicky, you're so inspiring." Vicky was thinking, just flabbergasted. She'd been in tears, she told me, pretty much every day. But somehow, she had been inspiring. It's not about putting on a brave face, is it? There's something about her. She told me that every day before going into her 12-and-a-half-hour shift, she'd prayed, "Lord, give me what I need for this today." And every day on the way, she'd listen to a particular worship song before getting to work. "Yet not I, but through Christ in me." The words go, or some of them, "The night is dark, but I am not forsaken. For by my side, the Saviour, he will stay. I labour on in weakness and rejoicing, for in my need, his power is displayed." Christ lives in us and shines through weakness, through distress. God had done something in Vicky that made others see her as an inspiration. I think the more we involve God, the richer our testimony becomes. So Paul encourages emotionally, witnesses clearly, and then he strengthens them physically by encouraging them to eat. Very interesting, isn't it? This sense of ministry that's growing and growing and growing, strengthening by asking them to eat. Eat already, he says, if you like. So what does he specifically do by asking them to eat? It's something that they hadn't done for days. Now I urge you, he says, to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And you'll find that in verse 34. So we care for people's physical well-being. Of course, you know that. But in lots of more normal situations, that may not be so obvious. Particularly perhaps for colleagues to notice that they've not been able to get away from that reception desk for 4 hours, or that they've not had a cup of coffee since yesterday evening. And so it goes on. So here is Paul caring for the heart, for the mind, for the body, and for the spirit. It's a holistic ministry. And then Paul does something which to us might seem quite odd, particularly in our politically correct times. He prays in public. He says, effectively, grace in public. A couple of years ago, my wife was working in theatre, an aesthetic nurse in the local hospital. And on the Sunday, she got a strong intimation from God that something bad was going to happen the next day. So she prayed about being ready, and she told me about it. And on the following morning, she went into work, and the theatre team that she worked with, about an hour into the shift, were called into the staff room to discover that one of her colleagues' 6-year-old sons had fallen out of a first-floor window and had died. And the person who delivered the news then said something like, "And do pray for her." Now that, I think, is startling enough to say in a staff meeting in a public context. But then my wife, Katrina, said, "Let's do it now." And right there and then she prayed in an NHS staff room with a mixture of Christians and people of other faiths and probably agnostics and atheists. But that moment, if you like, she took a stand to say, in this unimaginable pain, in this bewildering situation, there is a God who cares, and we can share this pain with him. In this situation, when all the skills of the NHS have done what they can, and on this occasion it was not enough, there is still a place to go. There is still someone to go to. No one came up to her afterwards and complained. And it's been wonderful to hear how so many people have felt free to speak more directly about God during these times. Because, of course, other people's ears and hearts have indeed been more open. But Paul here is not just giving thanks. He is modeling his faith in God's rescue. He's saying to them, I am calm enough to eat. I actually believe it is worth eating because I'm not going to die. So I'm going to need my strength. Eating at this point is a sign of his trust in God. And so when he persuades others to eat, when they actually eat, they're doing something that at some level is a step of trust in this God. Or at least in Paul's words. I trust enough in Paul's words to eat, to think that it's worth eating, because I'm not going to die either. So Paul invites them to live in line with his faith, to believe a little, to look to God, however thin their faith, however thin their grasp of who this God is or what he might do. But you probably picked it up. There's something very important about the words that Luke uses here. He took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. These are the same words Luke uses to describe Jesus breaking bread at the Last Supper and on the Emmaus Road. And there you can see it on the screen, just the comparison between them. The same words. Then he broke it, and he took bread, gave thanks, and gave it to him. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it. Paul is feeding on Christ here. How do we get through? We feed on Christ. And finally, Paul protects them, if you like, practically. His ministry is holistic ministry. He's interceded holistically. He's encouraged emotionally. He's witnessed clearly. He's strengthened physically. He's protected now practically. And how does he do that? Well, when the crew, the sailors, the professional sailors, try to leave, he gives the centurion a piece of advice, which this time the centurion accepts. Stop the sailors abandoning the ship. So yes, Paul is under enormous stress throughout this situation, life-threatening stress. But even under immense pressure, he does not lose sight of the mission he's been called to. So I wonder, do we have such a big multi-dimensional vision for the missional impact that we can make in the boats that we're in. And indeed, more broadly, the boats that our families and our fellow believers and our friends are in, whatever the pressures, in good times as well as in bad times. Do our children know that they are princes and princesses in the corridors and classrooms of their schools, sent to carry the fragrance of Christ and seek his kingdom there? Do they know that? Does the student in the university, the mother at the school gate, the barista in Costa, the labourer at the port, the executive in an office have such a rich vision, seeking the best for the people they meet and the organisations they're involved with, offering wisdom from above for physical protection, witnessing clearly and taking prayerful, practical initiative for the physical, emotional and spiritual welfare of those around them? Is this the kind of vision we're encouraging one another in our church communities? Paul was in a boat with a load of people, 275 people. What boat are you in? Who's with you? What's on their minds? What's God doing there? And what might he want you to do alone? And of course, wonderfully, we do not go alone. Acts 27 doesn't just give us a picture of the scope of our ministry. It gives us an insight into the faithfulness of the God who sends us with purpose, who grants favour among non-believers, who gives wisdom from above when wisdom from above is needed, wisdom beyond human computation is needed. He communicates whatever the barriers, sends an angel. However dark the day, however terrible the storm, he wants to communicate. He responds in prayer, making clear what he will do. He strengthens his people by word and presence. He keeps his promises. Not one person is lost. And he fulfills his purposes through you. The gospel, in Paul's case, will be heard in Rome as God intended. This is our God, the God of Paul and Lydia, Mary and Martha, Lou and Vicky, John and Felicia, and by astounding grace, your God and mine, Emmanuel. What needs changing where you are? Whose salvation might you pray for? What character quality do you need help with right now? Let's pray. Lord, on my front line, with the support of my brothers and sisters in Christ, help us all, please, Lord. Model your godly character. Make good work in the power of your Spirit. Minister grace and love day by day. Mould the culture around us with the fragrance of Christ. Be a mouthpiece for your truth and justice. And be a messenger for the gospel. For the shalom of the towns we serve, for the healing of our nation, for the blessing of salvation of many, and to the praise of your mighty name and your glory. May it be so. Amen.